Did women truly just work like really work, not just bake bread and weep prettily, but wield power, manage estates, wage war, and whisper secrets in the ears of kings? Forget everything you think you know about the Middle Ages. Because the truth is, they were running the show quietly, brilliantly, and often with a terrifying amount of style. Let's start with Isabella, the she-wolf. Seriously, she-wolf. It wasn't a nickname bestowed for her gentle nature. Edward II, a king known more for his fondness for boyfriends than for strategic thinking, got a serious dose of reality when Isabella, backed by her son, Edward III, decided he'd had enough. Deposed, yeah, she basically orchestrated a coup. And she didn't do it with a dainty fan and a polite request. She did it with a ruthless efficiency that would make Machiavelli proud. A 15-year-old girl wouldn't have been trusted with anything beyond embroidery, let alone a throne-grabbing scheme. Now picture this, a vast echoing hall in a medieval castle. Not filled with knights in shining armor, but with women. Not just ladies in waiting, fluttering around like exotic birds, but women who understood the workings of the entire operation. Christine de Pizan, a sharp-witted observer, noted that ladies of the land were basically running their husbands' affairs while they were off conquering territories or hosting lavish courtly gatherings. It wasn't a hobby, it was survival. Managing a farm, a workforce, a budget, all without a husband's steady hand. That's a skill set that would make a modern CEO blush. They weren't just keeping the home fires burning, they were building empires. Let's talk about Alice de Bourigny, a 15th-century lady whose steward, John, meticulously documented every single morsel consumed in her household. 6 breakfasts, 18 dinners, 12 suppers, it's a level of detail that would make a Michelin-starred chef weep with envy. And the food, forget bland, predictable fare. We're talking about 44 white loaves, 6 black rye, a mountain of oysters, smoked herrings, and a generous helping of merlings in place. All purchased with a budget of 2 shillings and 10 denarii, a sum equivalent to a week's wages for a skilled craftsman. A week's wages for a craftsman, mind you, to feed a household of at least 6, possibly more. The sheer scale of it is staggering, and the baking. Dame Alice's kitchens churned out 236 white loaves and 36 black loaves using just a quart of wheat. Meanwhile, 2 quarters of malt transformed into 112 gallons of ale. New Year's banquets. 15 shillings, enough to feed a crowd of Thomas Malcher and his 300 tenants, plus a scattering of wandering strangers. The logistics were insane. It wasn't just about cooking, it was about anticipating demand, managing supplies, and ensuring that everyone, from the lord of the manor to the scullion, was properly fed. But what about the threats? Medieval life wasn't a fairy tale. It was a constant struggle for survival, and wealthy houses were prime targets for Vikings, rival lords, invading armies, and disgruntled peasants. The Pastons, a prominent English gentry family, understood this implicitly. Their letters reveal a surprisingly pragmatic approach to defense. Marjorie Paston wasn't asking for a romantic gesture. She was demanding crossbows, windlasses, and quarrels weapons to protect her home from potential attackers. "We have never so much need," she wrote, hinting at a simmering tension and a readiness for conflict. A simple request for a few short poleaxes to keep indoors alongside a handful of jacks wasn't a plea for beauty, it was a calculated assessment of risk. And then there was the art. Noblewomen weren't just managing households and plotting defenses, they were patrons of the arts, commissioning poets, artists, and scribes. Books were status symbols, displays of wealth and refinement. It was a subtle but powerful way to assert their influence and distinguish themselves from the common rabble. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of collecting modern art, a way to signal sophistication and intellectual curiosity. But let's not mistake this for idle leisure. Noblewomen were also political players, advisors to their husbands, and intermediaries between families. They negotiated alliances, smoothed ruffled feathers, and cultivated relationships, all while navigating the treacherous currents of courtly intrigue. They weren't just decorative ornaments, they were strategic assets, wielding influence behind the scenes. Now let's talk about Anne of Bohemia, the queen who single-handedly averted a disaster in London. Richard II, a king notorious for his arrogance and cruelty, decided to punish the city for refusing to pay him a hefty fine. He suspended their liberties, deposed their mayor, and threatened to bankrupt them. But Anne wasn't going to let him get away with it. She pleaded with him in Windsor and Nottingham, begging him to restore London's autonomy, and then she went a step further. She knelt before him, practically begging for forgiveness. The image of a queen on her knees pleading for mercy is both humbling and terrifying. It's a testament to her power and determination. And then there's Eleanor of Aquitaine, a queen who defied expectations and shattered conventions. She wasn't just a consort, she was a warrior, a diplomat, and a force of nature. When her husband, Louis VII, embarked on a disastrous crusade, she took matters into her own hands, recruiting her ladies in waiting and rallying Aquitanian forces. She corresponded with her uncle, Raymond of Poitiers, plotting strategies and assessing the needs of the Crusader states. She wasn't waiting for her husband to lead, she was leading herself. And when the crusade failed, she didn't wallow in defeat. She divorced Louis and embarked on a new chapter, proving that she was more than capable of ruling her own destiny. But wait, there's more. Margaret of Anjou, a queen who ruled England during the tumultuous Wars of the Roses, was a whirlwind of activity. She wasn't just a passive observer, she was a key player in the political drama, advising her husband, Henry VI, and even leading the Lancastrian faction. And she didn't just dabble in politics. She was a patron of the arts, establishing Queen's College in Cambridge and introducing silk weaving to England. She was a queen, a warrior, an artist, and a businesswoman, all rolled into one formidable package. So what does all this tell us? It tells us that medieval women were far more than just decorative figures or dutiful wives. They were managers, strategists, warriors, artists, and political players. They were the engines of their households, the guardians of their estates, and the silent architects of their families' fortunes. They weren't simply workers, they were operators. They were running empires, one loaf of bread, one crossbow bolt, one carefully worded plea at a time. And yet their contributions were largely invisible. They were footnotes in history books, whispers in courtly tales, and shadows in the grand narratives of kings and battles. Their stories were often dismissed as domestic details, insignificant compared to the exploits of male rulers. But those details, the meticulous records of food consumption, the strategic planning for defense, the patronage of the arts, were the very foundations of medieval society. Consider the sheer scale of the work involved in running a medieval household. It wasn't just about cooking and cleaning. It was about managing a complex network of suppliers, overseeing a workforce, and ensuring that everyone, from the lord of the manor to the scullion, was properly cared for. It was a 24/7 operation demanding intelligence, resourcefulness, and a healthy dose of ruthlessness. And what about the women who didn't marry? The nuns, the widows, the women who chose to live independently. They weren't simply escaping the constraints of marriage, they were carving out their own paths, contributing to society in their own unique ways. They were abbesses, teachers, healers, and artisans, all challenging the prevailing assumptions about women's roles. Now let's address the elephant in the room, the idea that women didn't work in the Middle Ages. It's a persistent myth, perpetuated by a narrow interpretation of historical evidence. Archaeological discoveries, economic records, and even literary sources reveal a vibrant tapestry of female labor, from farming and brewing to weaving and metalworking. Women weren't simply idle bystanders, they were essential contributors to the economy and the social fabric of medieval society. And why is this idea so persistent? Partly because of the way that medieval people viewed women and work. Women were often seen as commodities traded in marriage to provide labor and produce heirs. Their value was primarily measured in terms of their reproductive capacity and their ability to manage a household. It was a system that systematically devalued women's contributions and denied them recognition for their achievements. The very concept of work as a separate sphere from home was a relatively modern invention. In the Middle Ages, domestic labor was simply part of life, inseparable from family, community, and religion. women weren't working, they were simply living. And yet, we tend to impose our modern categories onto the past, judging medieval women by the standards of our own time. So how did we arrive at this distorted view of medieval women? Partly it's because of the way that history has been written. For centuries, historians have focused on the actions of male rulers, neglecting the contributions of women. And partly it's because of the biases of our own culture. We tend to value individual achievement and recognize only those who break the mold. We're so focused on the exceptional that we overlook the ordinary, but it's time to change that. It's time to recognize the countless women who shaped the Middle Ages, not as passive figures in the background, but as active agents of change. They were the unsung heroes of their time, the quiet revolutionaries who defied expectations and built empires. The story of medieval women is not a story of oppression, it's a story of resilience, ingenuity, and determination. They weren't waiting for liberation, they were creating their own opportunities, forging their own destinies, and leaving their mark on the world. And when we finally start to see them for who they truly were, as complex, capable, and powerful individuals, we'll gain a much richer and more nuanced understanding of the Middle Ages. But let's be honest, isn't it a little sad that it took centuries to realize the full extent of their contributions? A little sad that so many of their stories were lost, forgotten, or dismissed as unimportant. And finally, the biggest question of all, if medieval women were so capable, so resourceful, so utterly dominant in their own spheres, why aren't we still hearing their voices? Why, after all this time, do we still struggle to imagine a world where women held the same power and influence as men?